Hey, welcome everyone. We still have another minute or so before we get started. So we're gonna give everyone a chance to log in and catch up. Okay, I show 12 o'clock. So to respect everyone's time, let's go ahead and get started. I know we're going to have others that will be logging in and joining us. So first I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Carl Olson. I'm the Vice President of the Oregon ITE section. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is the ITE May webinar on ODOT I-5 and I-205 tolling project update. Let's see here. So first off, I'd like to just lead with a couple of ITE announcements. The Oregon ITE Scholarship is open and is accepting applications until May 31st. So definitely encourage students who are interested to apply for that. We also have a variety of call for volunteers right now that we'd like to share. We're seeking volunteers to support the ITE International Western District Joint Meeting. We have need for volunteers for both Friday, July 23rd and Saturday, July 24th. There's a variety of things we're looking for volunteers for: the Mighty Race, the Social Hour, Traffic Bowl, career guidance, items like that. So if you're interested, please contact Pam O'Brien and she can work with you to get you assigned. And then we also are providing student informational interviews through Oregon ITE and currently looking for more individuals to help with that. So if you're interested, please go to our website and take a look. You can also email me or contact Oregon ITE directly through the website at oregonite1@gmail.com. And then finally, the last call for volunteers, the 2021 Better Blocks PSU project. They're still looking for technical advisors for 3 projects that they're working on. The Arleta Triangle, the Slip Lane to Pedestrian Plaza project, Community Green Space for Park Rows, and the City of Independence Neighborhood Greenways. So if you do a quick search for Better Block PSU, halfway down the page, there's a link to that you can click to be a volunteer for that. So definitely encourage anyone who has some availability to look into those 3 options. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Iwana, one of our co-chairs for the ITE ITS subcommittee. She will introduce, or she will at least advertise and discuss the upcoming events, thank our sponsors, and then we'll go from there. So Iwana.
Thank you, Carl. I would like to talk about our June webinar, June 29th. We will have Sensorama 2.0. It's the second part of our webinar. We had our first part in March. This one will focus on active transportation and safety and will include a panel on micromobility, a panel on passive detection for pedestrians and bicyclists, and last panel will be on wrong-way driving. Similar to our March webinar, this will be from 1 to 4 p.m. June 29th. And it should be very exciting. I'm looking forward to it. Before I hand this off to Anna, I'd like to thank our sponsors and their generous sponsors for making this possible on behalf of IT and ITS subcommittee.
Our speakers today are Mat Dolata and Chi Mai. Chi Mai is a transportation systems analysis engineer with ODOT Transportation Planning Analysis Unit. She has extensive experience in transportation systems analysis, traffic modeling, and data analytics. Mat Dolata is a senior transportation engineer with WSP, specializing in travel demand modeling and traffic forecasting, long-range planning, and regional mobility analysis. Mat has been working in Portland for over 15 years, including several different tolling pricing studies. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mat.
Okay, thanks, Anna. I am going to try and get my slides set up here. I think I'm showing the wrong screen, so let me fix that. Okay. Can people see the slides?
Yes, looks great.
All right, perfect. Thanks. Okay, so yeah, so Chi and I are going to give an update and really kind of an overview, providing some of the history about where the I-5 and I-205 toll projects here in Oregon have gone over the years. We're going to go kind of back and forth, presenting a few of the different projects. I'm going to start with a general overview of tolling, kind of why it's done, and kind of some examples from other regions. Chi's going to give the ODOT toll project history and background through including the value pricing feasibility analysis, the VPFA. I'll talk through briefly the technical approach that we used for that, and then we'll jump back in and talk about the current projects and where we're at. With the I-205 toll project being further ahead, and this being a group of transportation engineers, we'll kind of focus on some of the analysis we've done for that I-205 toll project before talking then about the regional mobility pricing project and that kind of coming up ahead. Okay, so let me jump in. Again, this is kind of general tolling overview. Why do we toll? What are the purposes and kind of the big picture? One of the biggest reasons to toll is to raise revenue, right? We all know VMT generally increasing. Meanwhile, vehicles are getting more fuel efficient, and so we're seeing decreases in the effectiveness of the gas tax and revenues are not keeping up. So tolls are seen as a way to kind of sustainably generate revenue for all the good things that we want to see, capital construction, maintenance, safety, all the good things that we work hard to deliver for our communities and public. So the other piece of it is reducing congestion. Apologies here. Reducing congestion. I'm trying to see something. Okay, so we have like traditional economic demand and supply. Pricing can balance that. Right now we have constrained supply, but really unconstrained demand. And so if you price it, you can kind of push back some of that demand and have a more efficient allocation of space. From a cost savings perspective, we also know we can perform more effectively. I'll get into that in a minute. And so tolling can be an alternative to costly capacity improvements and operate overall more efficiently. You know, the reality is that there's few goods or services that are unpriced. There are some, but few. So especially when the demand exceeds supply, as happens on a daily basis with vehicle travel, you know, we kind of can run into these overconsumption issues. So you think of it like another utility, like water. We all need it, we all want it, but we don't necessarily expect it to be free in the way that we do roads. And so that can result in overconsumption when a asset is free. Okay, so underpriced roads, they serve fewer people. So I think, you know, the current approach, like I said, kind of results in system efficiencies. Many of you are already familiar with the backward bending curve of speed on our x-axis here and speed on our y-axis and throughput on our x-axis. So as volume increases, speed goes down, and then we hit a breaking point, and then the volume also starts going down too when we bend back towards this red part of the curve. We lose throughput, we end up with queues, and congestion starts to spread outwards from our key bottlenecks. To avoid this situation, a small shift in demand, which pricing can create, can have a big impact on travel time and ultimately volume. Managed lanes with variable pricing have shown this to work, and the flow can be restored on our roadways. So different types of tolling, right? There's toll lanes, managed lanes, which are generally, I think, more popular in the US, and there's tolled roads and bridges. So for tolled lanes, only those lane users pay the toll. The adjacent general purpose lanes remain free. It's a choice of a lane. Whereas tolls and roads, everybody pays. It's a user fee paid by the vehicle owner, and so it's more of a route-based choice. In terms of the technology, it's open road tolling, so it's all electronic. Modern tolling systems typically use either in-vehicle transponders or license plate billings. There's some more emerging technologies, but that's standard practice these days. There's no more toll booths or plazas or anything like that where you have to slow down and stop to pay a toll. So of course there's necessary equipment to get all that set up, video cameras, etc. So I won't get into that, but that's what a modern tolling system looks like. Public opinion. So this can get tricky. So explaining those dual purposes or getting into traffic flow theory is not an easy message to communicate to the public. It's much easier to understand kind of supply side solutions, building more capacity, a bigger pipe. People get that. They don't necessarily get the dynamics of pricing. One of the things that we've seen kind of throughout the country historically is that political support is critical. So you need those political champions, and you need to not only get that up front, but maintain that support. And in some of these studies where, the planning and delivery of the project can take years, you have to hope that political support lasts through, the political wins and election cycles, et cetera. In terms of the public, most people generally are against tolling up front until they experience it. This has been repeated kind of throughout the country, where public opinion oftentimes prior to it is mixed at best, and then lowest right before opening. But then when people see the benefits and realize that, it tends to be popular and used by a broad cross section of the public. So let's talk about examples for a little bit. There's many throughout the country. We don't have tolling in Oregon except for a few bridges into Washington, but it's quite common. California and Washington are neighbors, and we have an example here in the Pacific Northwest of all-lane tolling with a variable toll rate schedule on SR 520, which is a 8-mile-long floating bridge between Seattle and Bellevue. Those tolls were started in 2012, kind of before the bridge was reconstructed, and construction was completed in 2016. So those tolls, they do vary by time of day. So overnight, it's just $1.25. During the peak hours, when it's highest, it goes up to $4.30. And then there's a surcharge, an additional charge compared to having a transponder of a $2 for license plate billing. So that's kind of a general overview of tolling. I'm going to hand it off to Chi to talk through the project history kind of on the ODOT side. Chi, go ahead.
I will walk you through the ODOT toll project history here in the Portland Metro region, but it should be noted that Metro and PBOT are currently working on their own studies on how to best apply pricing in the region. And they're all independent efforts, with ODOT's effort being focused on I-5 and I-205. And it's more advanced than the others just because we started a few years earlier. Next, please. So the genesis of the tolling projects come from the legislature. In 2017, the OTC developed the House Bill 2017 directs the OTC to develop a pricing proposal on I-205 and I-5, and then to seek FHWA approval for tolling. And then in response of the bill, the OTC directed ODOT to initiate the study in 2017 to explore the available tolling options, determine how and where tolling could help improve congestion on I-5 and I-205 during peak travel times, and begin to understand potential benefits and impacts to travelers and adjacent communities. The result of this effort was the value pricing feasibility analysis, in which we'll refer to as VPFA throughout this presentation. Next, please. So the purpose of tolls under the House Bill 2017 is a dual purpose to manage congestion and raise revenue to fund congestion relief projects. And it's a balance of those two. Next. So when we started the VPFA, we consider very broadly all the options available to highway pricing. And so in round one, we combine the different alternatives and that's available for highway pricing. One is to price all the roadways, all the lanes on the roadway. And then a second pricing strategy is to price lanes. And so we would take one lane, a general purpose lane, and price that. And then another option is another pricing of price lane option is to build a new lane with new capacity and price that new lane. And so those are the different strategies, and we try to combine and use a variety of different options, as you can see in the picture in the slide that show you the different combinations. Next, please. And so from what we learned in round one analysis, we applied to round two. And so in round two, we narrowed down to options that were feasible. And so under here, we had 5 concepts, and they're labeled A through E. And I won't go over each of them, but you can see from the picture where the tollings would be applied. Next, please. So based off of the results of round one and round two analysis, we produced a report to FHWA, and which gives a recommendation or a proposal to the implementation. And within that report, we have these different options. So on I-5, tolling from Multnomah to Going, and on I-205, tolling at the or near the Abernathy Bridge, and then also to later on apply a more region strategy of both I-5 and I-205, and also to develop mitigation strategies for low income and adjacent communities. Next, please. So this is the timeline of the VPFA. We started with the House Bill in mid-2017, and then we started the study in fall of 2017. We basically had just over a year to produce the report and submit to FHWA, in which OTC adopts and the PAC recommendations to give us direction on how to move forward with the next phase. Next, please. So I will come back to that timeline as I talk about the next phase, but I think for just to kind of continue with the VPFA conversation, Matt's going to present on the technical approach.
Yeah, thanks, Chi. Right, so this is a technical group, so we'll talk through some of the tools that we used. I mean, like Chi said, we had about a year, and so we really tried to leverage the existing kind of modeling tools that were available to us. You know, it's certainly a collaborative process with ODOT, Metro, and the consultant team to work through this. But really, there's 5 tools that I'm going to talk about here real briefly, the Oregon statewide integrated model, the Metro Regional Travel Demand Model, a toll optimization model with our partners at Eco Northwest, the Metro's multi-criteria evaluation tool, and then the MOVES emission simulator. So SWIM was really used to identify statewide impact. So this is the folks at ODOT, TPOW kind of own this model at the statewide level, Alex Bettinardi, and company. And so this is really looking at kind of beyond the metro region. What happens if we toll these roads, right? There's concern that there would be diversion over to other highways. We didn't really see a lot of that with it beyond the metro region, but it was an important thing to check on. Metro Regional Travel Demand Model, really the primary tool that kind of pivots off of all this, widely applied for a lot of planning and traffic forecasting applications. Those results kind of fed into a lot of these other tools, and the way that the model looks at tolling is it converts that monetary toll cost into a time penalty using value of time assumptions. And so that's how it gets fed in there, and that's how we quantify a lot of these regional impacts and diversion potential estimates in the value pricing feasibility analysis. The toll optimization model is really designed specifically for those managed lane concepts. Like Chi said, we were kind of ran through high level, what if we do individual lanes, as well as priced roadways. So it's looking at those freeway segments at a higher resolution, and really is very helpful for when you're establishing the appropriate toll rates. And then the MCE is a kind of a newer tool, a few years old now, but for Metro to kind of apply benefit cost analysis. It kind of processes those model results and gets at some of those kind of more challenging policy and impacts questions that are increasingly being asked of our projects. So this is just a pretty high level graphic, but it kind of shows the regional travel demand model here in the middle, and kind of how the relationship to these other tools, TOM, the data sources that feed into that, the regional model outputs, how they go into SWIM and MCE and MOVES, and kind of how they end up being used for performance measures to evaluate all these different concepts that Chi ran through. So just overall, I mean, she kind of gave the big picture summary, but the results were to recommend priced roadways, the price lane concepts. While they give you a good choice of lanes, they weren't as effective overall. These toll lane concepts, while they did have, particularly when we look at what we called Concept C, which was tolling all of I-5 and I-205, is a wider distribution of potential diversions and no unpriced lane, but they can function at a lower price, and then those benefits can be shared among more users. So whereas a managed lane would have a higher toll cost and benefit fewer users, the benefit of all lane tolling is that it's more widely distributed. So again, greatest potential for regional performance here, lower cost, better mode shift potential to HOV and active modes, but there's that trade-off of it's a regional project. But we have seen with variable tolls, that's proven as a tool to maintain speeds, improve travel times, and encourage other modes of travel. The VPFA analysis was showing us that these are also the expected outcomes for a priced roadway, kind of this regional strategy. So with that, I'll hand it back to Chi to talk through where we're at with our current projects that kind of came out of the VPFA and the next steps.
Chi, I think we lost your audio.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Yes.
You can now. You're good to go.
Hear me? Thank you.
I hear you now, Chi.
Okay, thank you. I have to learn to not mute myself in between. Harder to get back. Thank you. So where we are now, we've done a very robust community engagement process, and we've heard many comments. And so discussion with the public, regional stakeholders, and elected officials During the 2018 VPFA revealed 3 consistent themes. There's concern about impacts to low-income communities due to toll, the need for strategies to improve transit and other transportation choices, and concerns with the potential for freeway pricing to cause traffic to divert away from the toll facilities, resulting in rerouting to local streets. Next, please. Next, please. So as far as the timeline where we are, so after the VPFA phase, we went into the second phase where the current project began, and it was to take the direction from OTC, which was for us to develop the I-205 section from Stafford to Abernathy Bridge. And so in addition, in December of 2019, OTC directed the formation of EMAC, the Equity Mobility Advisory Committee. And then for the I-205 toll project, we're entering in August of 2020, we began the NEPA phase. And then, in December 2020, transition to regional tolling begins. So we have 2 concurrent efforts. One is the I-205 section from Stafford to Oregon 217, which is in the NEPA. And then for I-5 and I-205, more of that regional tolling strategy, that will be going into a PEL effort. Next, please. And this is a part of this slide is the Urban Mobility Comprehensive Congestion Management and Mobility Plan. And so the strategy for Region 1 is to have multiple tools. And so, for instance, this presents the different strategies. So we have targeted bottleneck improvements at bottleneck locations. We have bus on shoulder pilot. We have different strategies, but among them is tolling, and that would help to manage demand and then also generate revenues to pay for the other projects. Next, please. And this is a timeline. Just note that this is very preliminary or draft and that it could change, but it gives an indication of the different projects and their timeline. With tolling on I-205 being ready, I think, in 2024. Matt, can you help me? Is it 2020?
Yeah, the tolling on I-205 could be as early as 2024. Lost your audio, Chi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Next slide. Okay. So this is the slide of inputs from different entities that help to make the decision on tolling. One is the Oregon Legislature, and then the OTC, FHWA, and the ODOT toll program. And so there's a lot of information that gets passed back and forth based on our technical work. It gets advanced to others to make decisions, and equity is a major discussion group, and so it's a back and forth of different groups that finally makes the decision on tolling. Next, please. And this This slide talks about transit and travel choice impact. And the project has been and will continue to analyze change in transit ridership and mode shift between the toll and non-toll alternatives. And we're collaborating with transit and multimodal working groups to understand how planned transit improvements are associated with shifts related to tolls. Next, please. And we understand that diversion or rerouting is a big issue for locals. And so, you know, just to give definition of diversion, there is positive diversion, which is a change in the way that people make their trips, whether it's a change in the time of day, the destinations, modes, or trips not being made. People can group their trips, or they can defer it to a different time, or they can telework. And so those are positive diversions. And then there are negative diversion, which I think is also, we'd like to call it rerouting. And so if people are avoiding the toll facility and choosing to take a local system, then that would be a negative diversion. But also to note that rerouting also happens, we anticipate that it'll happen both ways, in which today there are trips that are diverting off of the highway already to avoid a certain bottleneck. And so if tolling comes in and that bottleneck is removed, then those trips may come back to the toll facility just to achieve better travel time. So we expect to see the rerouting to happen in both directions. And then the regional travel demand model illustrate that changes in demand over the course of the day. We'll be doing more detailed modeling, and we'll be collaborating. We have been and will continue to collaborate with our regional modeling group. Next, please.
All right, so this is kind of there's a little more here. My segment here is gonna suck up a little more time because this is the I-205 toll project, which is kind of further along, like Chi kind of showed on that timeline. So there's more kind of substance to this analysis at this point. So let me jump into some of those pieces. So this is this data is showing density and speed on I-205. It comes from the PSU portal. It was prepared by Peter Bosa at Metro during our DTA model calibration process. And what it really shows you is that beyond a certain density, about 25 vehicles per lane per minute, we start to see speed decreasing and breaking down. So this slide is the speed and the flow at the same point on I-205 east of 10th. So if you remember that backward bending curve that I showed earlier in the kind of general tolling overview, this is local data showing that same thing, kind of demonstrating that it's real. You see the flow, the volumes breaking back down. So speed is maintained up to a certain volume, around 1,500 vehicles per lane per hour, and then speed starts to degrade with more demand until it finally breaks down. At that point, you actually have less volume moving through the corridor. We've all seen this when we've driven around and seen traffic break down and kind of gridlock start happening. So tolling, again, can be used as a tool to limit how often that breakdown occurs. There's a sweet spot where traffic volume actually increases with tolls compared to current conditions. If we can kind of maintain that pivotal point before the conditions break down using tolls to manage demand, we can achieve that. That's again been demonstrated with managed lanes and particularly those that have dynamic pricing. We know that can work. So let me keep moving. The project purpose for I-205, you kind of saw the same slide graphic before from Chi for the overall House Bill 2017 and VPFA. As this I-205 toll project kind of enters into the NEPA process and the environmental assessment, there has to be a project purpose that's pass-fail criteria. So the I-205 toll project has dual purpose to manage congestion and generate revenue. On I-205, there's a connection with the extents for the I-205 improvements project, which is a widening and interchange improvement project that kind of parallels this. So the I-205 toll project really aims to balance those kind of objectives between traffic management and revenue generation. If the toll price is too low, that means congestion would remain prevalent and there wouldn't be enough funds to necessarily generated to support the improvements project. While if the toll rates are too high, this can result in too much diversion off of I-205 and actually a loss of potential revenues as you lose too many users. So finding the right balance is critical to the project outcomes. Beyond there's a long list here of goals and objectives. So these are the other issues that we're trying to tackle kind of beyond that pass-fail project purpose, the dual purpose. So we're talking about equitable benefits, traffic rerouting, safety, climate change, emissions, providing multimodal transportation choices, economic growth, travel demand management, and integration with the future regional toll system that we talked about, and then interoperability with other toll system in the toll system design. In the environmental assessment, there's a broad range of disciplines. We're obviously going to be focused on the transportation component with our shared interests, but I just want everybody to know that these are all included. They all have their own performance measures with these disciplines, but this is ultimately a transportation project, and so that's kind of driving our transportation as analysis is kind of fundamental to a lot of these and what the shifts in expected traffic volume are going to be. So I'll talk more about the transportation ones, but just want you all to be aware of the big picture. Okay, so the overall process for our alternatives analysis, we started with a screening of alternatives, and we've sort of been through this process already, so I'll talk about that. But that's kind of focused on how the tolls can be structured, where the gantries might be located. We're really using 2027 and leaning on that metro regional travel demand model to tell us what the impacts are going to be. And meanwhile, we're developing the tools knowing that for the NEPA analysis, the environmental assessment, there's a much more detailed study that needs to be done to answer all these questions. So we'll look at existing conditions. We'll look at, this is 2040, but it's 2045, future year impacts. We'll also continue looking at 2027. We'll expand that list of performance measures from what was used in the screening analysis, and we'll enhance and expand on the tools being applied. Ultimately, of course, the goal is to get to a project, a NEPA preferred alternative that's refined to include any mitigation strategies that are needed, complementary strategies such as transit, and along the way, we'll refine the assumptions and analysis tools to get there. So for I-205, just going back quickly to how this evolved. So the VPFA, the feasibility analysis, we had one alternative, concept E, and the finding there was this can manage congestion, generate revenue, right? The primary purpose, it's effective for I-205. Then in the initial screening, we came up with 5 alternatives. I'll run through those and as well as the no build. So are there certain toll configurations that have better outcomes? The environmental assessment, we're going to be down to 2 toll alternatives for a detailed study along with the no build. What are the impacts in detail of these different alternatives using kind of our more refined tools, and again, ultimately getting to a refined project that will then be brought forward to implementation. Okay, so I'll run through these briefly, these 5 alternatives. So the simplest one, the easiest to understand, is a toll on the Abernathy Bridge. It's just a bridge toll, single point, easy to understand, but really limited ability to manage traffic with just this one location. And furthermore, we saw kind of a concentrated rerouting pattern emerging through Oregon City. With one toll point, there's sort of a concentrated potential for rerouting there. Try to mitigate that by placing gantries on either side so that anybody who hops off of I-205 and then gets right back on might be captured. Ultimately, we saw that that wasn't necessarily the majority of the diversion that was happening, but that was one of the alternatives that were tested. Another alternative 3, splits the toll between 2 locations. So in this case, a through trip, somebody who's just passing through is essentially experiencing the same toll cost as in alternative 1, but someone who's getting off locally would essentially pay half the toll if they're only using one of these locations. And then advancing that kind of theme of breaking up the toll, this is alternative 4, which conveniently breaks up the toll into 4 segments. So this is kind of the most flexible for traffic operations, but most complex too from the alternatives that we were looking at from a pricing structure. And then the final alternative was alternative 5, which was a single zone toll. So if you entered anywhere, whether it was in the main line or one of the local ramps, you paid the same cost. Basically, it was an entrance fee into this piece of the corridor. And then so a through trip is paying the same amount here as a local trip. And so this is a little more complex, more toll location points, but easy to understand because it's one toll rate for everybody. Okay, so our regional model results, we looked at changes on I-205. So saw less overall traffic compared to the no toll, no build scenarios. So daily volume decrease of 15 to 35% on 205. We saw actually more diversion off of I-205 during these off-peak hours on a percentage basis. Peak hours were decreasing a little less, even though we assumed higher costs, just because I guess in large part because of the travel time differences, right? When the surrounding network gets congested as well, those alternatives might not be quite as attractive. Overall, we saw the diversion was kind of pretty well aligned with the corridor. If you looked, the diversion rates quickly fell off as soon as you looked outside of the toll segment. So the decrease dropped to about 10 to 20% between I-5 and Stafford Road to the west or south if you're using the north-south I-205 orientation, and then to the east or north, daily volume decreased only 5 to 10% on 82nd Drive. So it was kind of a stronger local effect than necessarily a regional effect. We didn't see a big shift onto over to I-5, for example, that people might have expected. So again, kind of talking on that diversion topic, Chi kind of hit on there's maybe good diversion or bad diversion. You know, that's kind of one way to look at it. We also looked at it as where is this traffic diverting to? So there's kind of the regional components like I-5, like I said, where, you know, didn't necessarily see a big differentiation in those and didn't see as much of it as I think some folks expected. Local near the tolled area, we did see, you know, kind of significant difference, and that's where these alternatives really kind of play out differently. In terms of the sort of better form of diversion, you know, we did see the sort of transportation demand management components, the change in the time of departure, destination, shifts over to shared rides or transit. You know, I think folks wonder if that will really happen. I think most people would kind of assume that the rerouting, the sort of bad diversion is going to be the main one, but we did see evidence that at least there would be some kind of those sort of TDM changes. There were going to be fewer drive alone trips, more shared rides by about 4,000 to 5,000 per day. The shift to transit was relatively small when looking at this I-205 concept, fewer than 500 additional transit trips. So most of the shifts were SOV to HOV. But overall, when we looked at some of our performance measures like VMT and VHT in the system, we do see overall fewer cars on the roads and less time spent driving and less congestion overall in the region. So overall, the two that moved ahead were the ones that broke up the tolls. Alternative 3 broke it between 2 points and alternative 4. So there was different evaluation that went into this, the overall system effects, what was happening on I-205, the level of diversion. A couple of things that kind of caught our eye or concerning was where sort of those concentrated rerouting patterns emerged. So we talked about alternative 1, kind of having a concentrated one through Oregon City. Alternative 1 also just kind of had the overall least effective performance. Alternative 5 kind of had a little bit of the same thing where it kind of favored a through trip. It was better for a through trip, but without that local discount, there was a bit more local diversion kind of concentrated on the outer extents of the toll zone, including in Gladstone. So alternative 4 overall kind of, and when you spread out the toll, you kind of spread out the rerouting effect. So there's a wider geography, but it ends up being less concentrated and potentially less impactful. And these also, with the more toll points, you have greater long-term flexibility to manage the system and kind of and the flexibility to adapt to the regional system. Again, kind of Chi talked about this, but there's a lot of outreach and engagement going on with this from the I-205 work and, you know, kind of consistent with the themes. There's certainly a lot of desire for more information. A lot of people are opposed to tolls up front, which is not really surprising. So the project team has to work hard to address those concerns. We certainly have heard that the impacts of tolling are important. Clarity on how those revenues are going to be used. Local residents in Clackamas County are definitely concerned about diversion, and really they're concerned about the rerouting effects and how that plays out. As this project has kind of unrolled through COVID-19, there's certainly many concerns and questions related to that. And yeah, so again, not surprising, but opposition and requests for better and more information. So we're working on that. The project, like I said, has kicked off the environmental assessment, providing more detailed analysis through that. And including the traffic impact analysis. So technical analysis won't be completed until next year, but we do have some early results to share. We're not just gonna wait for some big grand reveal. I think there will be pieces coming out in increments. So I wanna share a few of those with this group. So one is the corridor user analysis. So we just published that recently, so I'll get into that a little bit. We do have kind of a draft methodology report for the transportation technical report. That'll be kind of the big deliverable that covers the traffic impacts and multimodal impacts. I do also want to talk about the sub-area dynamic traffic assignment model that we've, for the I-205 corridor that we've been developing in conjunction with Metro. So let me jump through quickly each of these three. So the I-205 corridor user analysis. So here we're using streetlight data platform. I think most of you have probably heard of, the big data and the mobility platform users. We're using that to help us understand the user travel patterns in the corridor. We're using pre-COVID 2019 weekday data to answer where are users coming from, how far and which routes are they using as they go along I-205. And she talked about kind of existing diversion, like due to congestion. Are people rerouting to avoid congestion on I-205? If you talk to folks who live in these communities, there are, but that's not always an easy thing to demonstrate. And then I think also just looking at the travel patterns and comparing with the regional travel demand model. This is another source, a totally different data source than the regional travel demand model. So it's good to compare and see how they match up. So we looked at origin and destination analysis, relatively high level, kind of at the regional scale, looking at the trips and origins that cross the origins and destinations of trips that cross the Abernathy Bridge on I-205. We're seeing a higher share kind of locally, not too surprising. A piece that might be surprising is that only about 10 to 15% of the trips are coming from outside the region. And when we looked at these numbers and compared to the regional travel demand models, were really a surprisingly good fit. Actually, all of these were within 1%. We did notice some differences kind of around this airport area, which kind of makes sense. Either, that's sort of a unique area from a travel perspective that, any tool could apparently not match, but that one was more off, about 2% off than the other ones. All the others were within 1%. So that was encouraging. Looking at travel sheds, I think many of you have probably seen things like this, where we look at, in this example here, we're showing northbound trips going across the Abernathy Bridge. So where do they go to? What routes do they connect from? So you're starting at 100% of trips hitting at the Abernathy Bridge, and you're kind of peeling off as people go to get to their destinations. And one thing that we learned was interesting about this is that about 80% of the trips had already peeled off before you get to I-84. So in terms of Washingtonians or trips destined to Washington, that was about 5% or less continuing on into Washington. So in terms of the characteristics of people and how they get on or off I-205 between Stafford and Oregon 213, I thought this was pretty interesting. The through trips, which we're defining as traveling end to end on either side of the corridor, make up about a quarter of the trips, which means that the remaining 3/4 are trips that enter or exit I-205 somewhere between Stafford or Oregon 213. We call those local access trips. So they could be regional in nature, but they're getting on or off locally. And then you're looking at just trips that get on and off within our corridor, right? Our 4 segments of I-205, that's about 15 to 20%. So that's very kind of internal local trips that are getting on and off I-205 after a relatively short distance of travel. And then the sort of existing diversion due to congestion, what we did is we looked at routing breakdowns between different origin and destination patterns. We compared them for the midday as opposed to the peak hours, AM and PM peak. And we looked at kind of the distribution of routing. So this one that you can see over here is the northbound trips from Salem to Oregon City. And you can see in the midday, about 70% of them are staying on I-5 and routing over to I-205, while some share is during the midday, even when maybe there isn't a lot of congestion. They might be going to South Oregon City. About 30% are using that. The shift, the difference that we're seeing here is kind of how we look at it, the shift to congestion. So over here on the right, you have the PM peak. So if you look at that change, that's about a third of trips could be shifting over to 99E. So when we talk about existing diversion, this is what we're talking about. Generally, it's aligned with the congestion. These shifts, these changes are generally aligned with congestion patterns. In directionally, AM versus PM, there's directional congestion right now on I-205, and we saw those patterns. So we looked at these kind of more regional patterns. We looked locally, and we saw really consistent evidence of these shifts happening and how people use I-205. So let me jump now to the Transportation Technical Report. I think this is the information a lot of people are really looking for, existing and future conditions, a traffic operations analysis, comparing to mobility standard. What's gonna happen after we toll? Are we gonna break a bunch of intersections? Are we gonna have safety impacts? How are multimodal facilities gonna be impacted? This is kind of the methodology. We're at that stage where we're defining the methodology to do that analysis. So really addressing that, the impacts of the project comparing to the no build scenario. So we've got an initial API. We're going to reassess this after we get the 2045 model results and the DTA results as well. We've got some thresholds identified. This is a relatively tight API that we're working with right now. We're definitely going to reevaluate this, and we've defined some criteria where we would look beyond kind of the core area. In terms of travel forecasting, I mentioned this earlier, we'll look at existing conditions, interim year and future year. We'll be using the regional travel demand model to develop those. We'll be doing traffic analysis. I think this is relatively straightforward for this audience, but just so everybody knows, there's really 3 levels to the traffic analysis. So we're going to start with the regional model, then we're going to go to the sub-area DTA model, and then we're going to do the kind of traditional location-specific traffic operations analysis, multi-resolution modeling approach. So again, looking 2045, but also kind of short-term, the 2027 horizon shortly after opening. So let me talk about the DTA model a little bit. So we're really going from, this is working closely with Metro and their team. They're really kind of taking the lead on this. So the regional travel demand model going to a regional DTA structure and then zooming into the sub-area DTA with a lot more detail. The DTA model, for those of you who are familiar, this is a lot more detail than a regional travel demand model. It's got the lanes in there, specific intersection control assumptions, simplified relative to the micro simulation and VSIM analysis, but making a big step towards that kind of analysis. So I won't get into details here, but the calibration process was calibrated to volume and travel time. And again, I can't thank Peter Bosa and his efforts kind of working with us to get this all calibrated and up to speed. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We're in the process of developing these tools, defining their approach, refining some of these modeling tools, and moving this project ahead. So with that, I'll hand it off back to Chi to talk about the regional mobility pricing project.
Can you hear me? Matt, can you hear me? Okay, good. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 2 efforts going on right now. One is the I-205 project, tolling project that Matt just described. And then the second is the regional mobility pricing project, which is looking at I-5 and I-205 as the entire corridors. And so we're going through the Pell right now, and we just started. And for those that aren't familiar with Pell, or we also call it pre-NEPA, it allows us to use planning products and which are documents, reports, analysis. And the benefits is that it reduces duplication of effort in different project phases, encourages early engagement to help develop the project vision, shared understanding, and goals, and also has the framework to ask some key questions and make some robust project decisions. And then it also gives us the opportunity for our partner and public input on these decisions so that we can rely on them for future phases. Next, please. So we'll be building upon the past work of the VPFA. All the work that we've done through there will take key pieces out of there, all the benefits of the stakeholder and the public concerns, all the traffic analysis and the alternatives development. And then we also will rely on the EMAC committee to help us with the continuation of development of the equity framework. And then we also will be coordinating with the I-205 toll project. Next, please. So the key questions that PEL will focus on regional strategy to address the primary goals and priorities, and then how equity concerns can be best addressed and brought into tolling projects, and to clarify relationship to regional projects, and then also screening down to best alternatives to carry forward to the detailed NEPA analysis. Next, please. The PEL outcome we want to achieve is to clearly communicate the project goals and have the frequent communication with our partners, and then also have the shared understanding of project schedule and inputs. And so with the outcome, we hope to have a very clear statement and purpose of the needs and goals and objectives, and have the performance measures established, and then also have the alternatives for NEPA and the NEPA document classification, whether it's an EA or an EIS. Next, please. And this is the timeline for that. We're discussing key questions, and then we are heading in the early summer of developing the draft purpose and need. And then we'll move into the initial screening of the alternatives. We'll be refining the screening alternatives by the fall. And then in winter is when we have the NEPA purpose and need. And then early next year is the NEPA alternatives. Next, please. So that concludes our presentation, and we're now open for questions. Let me open the chat. Carl, how do you like us to handle this? I'm still trying to access the chat.
I can go ahead if you'd like. I can read off some of the questions that have been coming in, and then you can answer that way if that's easier.
I think that would be best. Thank you.
Okay. So let's do that. So one of the first questions we received earlier on, there aren't many comparable alternatives in this region that drivers can take. You mentioned that the model doesn't show much diversion on non-freeway roads, but this may be very well related to the lack of alternative routes. Is the tolling project also considering improving regional transportation network so drivers can have more choices?
Matt, do you want me to address that?
I think you choose.
Yeah. Well, in an earlier slide, we said that we look at the transit component. So that is one option to for people as a to the switch mode. And then I think part of this is that balancing of of the revenue generation and congestion. So I think that as people, as we have the revenue, we'll be able to build some of these planned targeted bottleneck locations, which makes the flow on the facility another enhancement. And then I think a third thing is when I spoke earlier about the diversion of back and forth rerouting, it'll be a shuffle of traffic and opportunities. And at the end of the day, as we look at rerouting, and if there are local facilities that are impacted heavily by new trips, there will be mitigation options that will enhance those facilities so that people will have a safe and better driving experience as compared to no bill.
Okay, next question that came in. What is the plan for residents of the area? Are they considered the cost of doing business because they can afford to pay the fees to travel roads in the area and the ramps they rely on to go to and from work? Is that equitable?
Have a very robust equity group that's targeting those questions, and I think when the plan comes out, that will be addressed. But we do have that's what the EMAC group is for, and the framework that they are developing.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, through the I ran through that screening analysis pretty quickly, but I thought one of the benefits potentially of the project design was that alternatives 3 and 4 for I-205 do break up the toll costs. So effectively that provides a discount for some local users who are accessing the system locally. So in the example of alternative 3, if you're getting on or off at Oregon 43, you're essentially paying half the toll of a through user. So I guess that's one sort of benefit, at least from my perspective, as I saw it, to limit the cost of those local users. Of course, there are those regional through trips passing through, as well as local users. So it's really a dynamic situation where you have a lot of different users and a lot of different impacts. And I think that applies to the same question about diversion too. You know, if we're talking about a regional trip, you have I-5 available as an alternative to you. And I think people tend to think of those regional through trips, but for local users, I-5 isn't really an alternative. So they might look at going across the Oregon City Arch Bridge, and we saw those potential impacts in one of our alternatives, or using, you know, some of those parallel routes like Willamette Falls Drive and Borland Road. So it really depends on the travel pattern that you're talking about, and it's quite a dynamic situation.
Okay, next question. You say that one of the forms of divergence would be people choosing to travel at different times of the day. Is that because there's a difference in the toll price based on the time of day?
Yeah. The toll will be variable. Right now, what we're looking at, the pricing structure is that there's no toll at night or very minimal. And then it varies. I think during the peak hours is when it's the highest, and then during the shoulder or the non-peak is when it's lower. So then it encourages people to drive during a time that the roadway capacity are available.
As work from home becomes more mainstream, how might this impact toll revenues and the effectiveness if there is less home to work to home trips?
Well, we're monitoring all of that. ODOT does monitor traffic during COVID time, and we're still doing it. And we're seeing that traffic has recovered to about 10% of pre-pandemic demand and congestion level, both in volume And so we feel that we'll continue to monitor that. And we're still trying to figure out what those trips are. If people are working from home, maybe they're making different type of trips, but we are monitoring that, but we are not seeing the depressed type of demand that we saw last year during this time, or certain immediately following the stay home order. We feel that people are out back on the road driving.
We got two questions that are somewhat similar, so I'll do my best to kind of mush them together. But you showed 99E as a diversion right now. Have you looked at specific impacts to, say, the county or city roads like Eck, Borland, Willamette Way, Rosemont? And did the analysis of these kind of frontage roads take into account school bus stops, pedestrians, bicyclists, and other vulnerable users?
Do you want me to handle this? Sure. So yeah, so kind of like I said, the diversion question is quite dynamic. I guess there's in my mind, there's kind of three levels of looking at it. In the value pricing feasibility analysis, when we looked at concept E, we looked very high level of like which routes could be impacted, and 99E was one that got for sure identified. Through the screening analysis going into the I-205 toll project, we looked more at the scale of potential impacts, and we kind of zoomed into that study area, and we did see other potential routes, right? Willamette Falls Drive, and we saw differentiation between some of these screening alternatives. Of some of them have more or less impact on Willamette Falls Drive or Borland or some of those other surrounding areas. I think one kind of big maybe takeaway from the screening analysis was there is, on the regional scale, there wasn't as much of the diversion, but when you started looking into the local areas, you know, it was potentially more impactful and more differentiated between these different alternatives that we saw. So the next phase of that's where the screening analysis is taken as kind of the scale of potential diversion over the course of the day. We kind of identified hotspots, but when we get to talking about the specific impacts, right, to operations, to pedestrians, to transit routes, all of that, that's where this next phase, the environmental assessment, really gets into kind of those details and seeing, okay, well, maybe we have some circulation changes that are affecting a road like Rosemont, or an intersection like maybe Rosemont or on Willamette Falls Drive. So that's really that more detailed, that transportation tech report will get into those specific elements.
Okay, the next comment / possible question: kudos to ODOT for doing the regional mobility and expanding the tolling study. As Matt mentioned, a surprising amount of trips on I-5 and I-205 are relatively local trips that might be better served on local roadways. Can you study if variable tolling on ramps can replace the need for ramp metering?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's a good question. I think ramp metering's there to kind of manage traffic operations in very congested conditions, and tolling has the potential to resolve that. So I think that's something that we can talk about more and discuss more. That's sort of you know, a little bit of that more detailed operational level. How do we adjust potentially ramp metering under kind of new conditions that could look a lot different than the conditions we have today?
Do you have an idea of what the toll amounts would be?
Well, I think I can start first, and then Matt can chime in. But right now, we're looking at different strategies. But ultimately, it will be an OTC decision and not ODOT or the project team.
Yeah, I think there's also the question in here about IBR, and I think that the two projects are relatively independent. We didn't see a lot of shifts you know, on I-5 due to anything that was being done on I-205. I think the regional, you know, these studies kind of have to look at each other and compare if they're affecting each other, but we didn't see anything in the screening analysis that would point to, you know, a significant impact to what the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project is doing at this point.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into that second question. Does tolling along I-5 and I-205 kind of poison the well for getting tolls on the I-5 bridge replacement?
So, do you want me to answer, Chi?
Sure.
I don't think so. I think you know, hopefully it would be kind of the other way around, and I-205 could potentially be a success story for tolling, and then you know, you could look more broadly from there. Again, I don't expect it to directly affect I-5 in a tangible, or the Interstate Bridge Project in a real tangible way. But I think that's a good question that needs to be kind of followed up upon and checked back periodically. If there's any major changes to the analysis or the assumptions, those would need to check back on how they could affect other projects.
Will the Oregon toll program establish its own central back office system or use the WashDOT back office system?
I'm not too familiar with this, but my understanding is that we will establish our own team and back office. I'd have to, I'm more on the traffic side versus the operations side. Do you know, Matt? Is that your understanding as well?
My understand, yeah, same thing. It's that there's probably people better than Chi and I to answer this question in detail, but my understanding is that's the plan, that ODOT would have its own toll program and operate its own back office, and you know, I think that WashDOT and ODOT are collaborating very closely, specifically on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project. So you know, there could be potentially arrangements of and efficiencies and opportunities there, but my understanding is that ultimately ODOT wants to establish its own toll program that's interoperable and you know, kind of works effectively with Washington, given our proximity.
Okay. And down to a couple last questions here. Are there plans to add lanes on either highway?
There is just the plans, like I mentioned earlier, with the different projects, which are to support those planned projects that are targeted at the bottlenecks, but we don't at this time intend to add additional projects or additional lanes at this time.
And then this is just to the presenters. Do you have contact information you were willing for me to share to individuals should they follow up with you? That was a request. And then another request was if a version of your presentation is also an option to be made available.
Yes, we'll share the slides, and then, like I mentioned earlier, that we really believe in outreach and having a very comprehensive and robust outreach. So we would love to meet with you or whoever, and we have different people at ODOT, whether it's technical or if you're more interested in the policy or the equity. We have different staff that are very well versed in each of those areas, and we would love to arrange the meeting.
Okay, great. And then this, just so everyone knows too, this presentation is recorded. So at a later time, if you're an attendee, once that recording is made available, you're welcome to go back and review that. We have another question that slipped in. I know we have until 1:30, but I don't want to pepper you guys too harshly. So I thank you for sticking with us. Next question. My expectation would be that traffic volumes on local streets like Willamette Falls Drive, would be limited during peak hours due to existing congestion. However, it seems likely that high volumes may persist outside of peak hours due to the combination of desire to avoid tolls plus the available off-peak capacity. Do you see evidence of this type of change in off-peak travel demands in your models?
I can take a stab at that one. I think that it's really dynamic because you have you have the existing diversion patterns due to congestion, and so once you resolve congestion, you get some of those traffic patterns moving back to I-205. But then you have those toll of right, and you don't have that during the off-peak toll hours, but you do have the toll diversion potential. So it really matters which routes you're looking at. Some of the demand also on parallel roadways, it's not necessarily that parallel roadway is just an alternative route, right? It's a route that's getting used to access I-205 directly. So it's, you know, like 99E, a lot of the trips on there are trying to get onto I-205. So if they're avoiding the toll, they might not be on 99E anymore. So it can be pretty dynamic, but to get to the off-peak and peak issue, we did see that potentially that you know, there were on a kind of a percentage basis, there was a higher level of diversion during those off-peak hours. So it's really a dynamic thing and a different way of I think thinking and looking at traffic circulation patterns than what we're maybe used to for sort of traditional capacity projects that are focused only on the peak hours.
Well, that's it for the questions that I have for today. So thank you, Chi. Thank you, Matt, for being available and willing to provide a presentation to the Oregon ITE audience and to everyone that was able to attend. I think this is actually one of the best attended webinars we've had over the last many years. So thank you. I know it's an interesting topic.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending. Until next time, definitely, if you haven't visited our website, OregonITE.org, and then you can sign up on any future mailing list and also see for our upcoming activities. So thank you.